first time, this country has a cabinet secretary who is Indigenous. I come from ancestors who endured the horrors of Indian boarding school assimilation policies carried out by the same department that I now lead, the same agency that tried to eradicate our culture, our language, our spiritual practices, and our people. Today, I'm announcing and sharing with you all, first, that the department will launch the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative.
From the Tulsa massacre to Native American boarding schools, this year the Biden administration and America more broadly has begun to reckon with some of the darkest and most painful parts of our history. Until now, the devastating and at times fatal history of Native American children taken forcibly from their communities and put into boarding schools that strip them of their culture has never been fully investigated. Secretary Haaland's investigation announcement comes after comes after the remains of nearly 1,000 children were uncovered in unmarked graves at similar boarding schools in Canada. And as horrifying as those numbers are, some experts expect the death toll from U.S. boarding schools to be much higher. I'm joined now by Brett Shelton, lawyer for the Native American Right Fund, with a focus on these boarding schools. And Brett, obviously, this is a landmark investigation, the first time the United States has taken any sort of accountability for these boarding schools and the impacts they had on Native communities. How significant is it that we're even opening this investigation, that we are starting to look?
This is a huge first step. This really is landmark. It's the first time the United States has taken steps towards reconciliation over this policy of forced assimilation that lasted over 100 years.
Obviously, this is going to be a long and I presume quite painful process. What does it take to unravel a century of pain and trauma like this? And what do you like to see come out on the other side? What should this investigation produce?
There's going to have to be a massive undertaking in terms of the investigation about what happened. It's not really known how many children were involved, who they were, and what happened to them. So a full accounting needs to happen. And most of those records are old by now, and they're buried within the federal archives probably, and also within church archives of the churches who ran the schools. What we'd like to see on the other end of it, obviously the truth-telling about what happened is the first step in any reconciliation process. So that's a big first step. It's also important to document why that matters today, and it does. For example, transgenerational transference of trauma has become known in the field of psychology in recent years, but it's not so well known outside of that field. So it'd be good to show why what happened at the boarding school still matters today within our communities. And then also moving forward, how do we heal from what happened? And the tribal communities themselves already have good ideas about that because they've been trying to heal all along. Hopefully they'll be able to get some help with that.
I want to broaden the context here a little bit. We're in this time as a country where we're grappling with how to confront darker, painful periods of our history head on and how to teach real history to younger generations. I grew up in Texas. I didn't learn about this when I was in school. In your view, how pivotal is this investigation, our efforts like this one, to make sure that the history we are teaching is complete?
This is a huge first step. This is the first time I'm aware of the United States has so willingly taken on the responsibility to become more knowledgeable of and more truthful about what actually happened in the past. And it's essential to move forward, like I said before. So this is great, and hopefully it will spark an interest and lead to more and more understanding about what the real history of the nation's past is. Only when we understand that past can we really move forward intentionally.
Here's what we could be looking at in the future. Canada's 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Report described the residential schools there as, quote, more than simply an education program. It was an integral part of a conscious policy of cultural genocide. Do you expect the United States to go that far? Was this cultural genocide on U.S. soil?
Yes, it was. That was clearly the intent. One of the more famous catchphrases by one of the major proponents of the thing was to kill the Indian in order to save the man inside the child. That was who was leading the charge basically was saying that. And yes, the United States will be very similar to Canada. In fact, Canada modeled its system after the United States, and there's good documentation in the historical record of that. So
that's interesting. So what can we then learn from Canada, which they built on us, this Truth and Reconciliation efforts that they first put in place there, and the Canadian First Nations communities that are still facing challenges years after that report was completed?
I think the most present lesson now is we need to be thorough enough, and that's the danger that we have by thinking we would be done with this within a year. Secretary Haaland's investigation is set to go for a year. It will take longer than 1 year to fully research and document over 100 years worth of policy and practice. And so we need to not just check the box after this year, but I think it'll open a lot of doors. The recent discovery of the graves, despite all that Canada's done for over a decade, is an indicator of the need to be more thorough. And another process that we need to pay attention to in Canada was just pay attention to the mistakes that they learned along the way. For example, they early on took testimony from survivors, and that was harmful to the mental health of the survivors and their families in ways that they later patched up and made a system that involved aftercare for them. So learning from those type of mistakes will be really critical too.